And today we're actually discussing the role of the West, the role also of international institutions, international organizations, and international civil society. So all this is part of a larger long-term project of Free Russia Foundation, which is called the Transition Project. And it's seriously, it's not just about envisioning a future free Russia. It's also and mostly about the way to get there and what has to happen in the meantime between today, this moment in time, and the future free Russia, post-imperial Russia, and democratic Russia. Okay. So let me just briefly introduce our speakers today, or kickoff speakers, because we want to have a debate, not only among us, but also with the participants. For that, please use the webinar chat. So ask your questions in the chat, and then we will try to answer them, or voice your opinions. You do not necessarily have to ask only a question. So let me just, without further ado, introduce our speakers. We've got Sergey Lagodinsky. He's got a green background because he comes from the Green Party in the European Parliament. Sergey has a rich background in international affairs and has been in the European member of the European Parliament since 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Yes, right. Absolutely. Great to be here.
Okay, great to have you. Furthermore, we've got Suren Avanesyan from U.S. Agency for International Development, based in Washington. One of the international organizations that clearly, obviously, have a big role to play in supporting Russia's transition to democracy. And last but by no means least, we have Sam Greene from the Center for European Policy Analysis. Actually, you know, arguably in the rich think tank scene of Washington, one of the most interesting animals. Small, but I mean, relatively small for Washington conditions, but extremely active and vocal on all questions concerning Central Europe and, of course, the eastern part of the European continent. So, having said this, I just want to try to frame the question that we're discussing today. You see, when we talk about Russia's future transition to democracy, I think there are three mega challenges for the West and international organizations. And I call them the moment, the carrots, and the stick. So the challenge for the moment, of course, is to recognize when actually this transition is irrevocably happening, or is recognizably happening. So one thing is to define that a point in time when Russia is moving towards freedom. The carrots is the question of, from that moment onwards, which incentives the West and international organizations should provide for Russia to stay on course. And finally, the sticks, obviously, I mean, that follows from what I just said, is which possible sanctions should be used to actually keep Russia on course and try to stabilize the development towards democracy. So enough from my side. Just one word. Of course, we are discussing this in the context of a major publication by Free Russia Foundation, the Transition Project, and particularly today we're discussing the chapter by Vasily Gatov and Vadim Grishin about the role of international organizations. So that is actually the particular segment that we're discussing today. I hope to collect as many ideas and concrete proposals as possible when it comes to these general questions that I asked in the beginning. Okay, Without further ado, I propose that Sergey Lagodinsky, you will have to leave us around 5 p.m. Brussels time, 11 a.m. Washington time. So you go first, and besides, you're the only elected representative of the people here. So
I'm okay. I'm not that vain. It's
you
fine.
go ahead with your kickoff.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and thanks for the paper, which is a really interesting and in-depth analysis of opportunities. I would like to start with one from the very beginning, one moment, which I think is an important point when we start talking about international organizations and the role of international organizations. And in this paper, European Union is mentioned as one of those. I think we should be cautious in our exchange with each other and how we understand international relations, and on the one hand, and European processes on the other hand. And to be honest, for most of European politicians, putting European Union on the same level as OSCE and talking about European Union as an international organization is a bit of an insult. I don't take it personally, but I think it's important if we want to start this discussion on even level. Then it's also important that the Russian view of international arena and of European Union also evolves and be a little bit more and tries to understand how Europeans understand themselves. And for Europeans, European Union is not an international organization; it's a supranational organization. Some would even say it's something like the Confederation. So that's on the outset of what has been said. And generally, I think that we will have to differentiate between various goals that we are looking for in terms of including and integrating Russia into international system after some sort of transition or transformation that will be taking place. And apart from the fact that we, of course, want Russia to be human rights oriented and value oriented country, we need to think about how to think in two steps. What we're doing now, we're thinking in one step, which is basically illusionary, maybe some people would say at this point. But at that point, we will have to see on how to lock in Russia, the new Russia, into an international order and international order of values. This is something that we usually say, happens with European Union, where, the lock-in theorists say this is actually the purpose of most international regimes, on how to create a system of monitoring and also of enforcing, but also a system of incentives where a country is no more, cannot go rogue anymore in terms of its values and in terms of its trajectory. And this is something that I think should be discussed on this level and should become also an additional dimension to this paper. Beyond that, I think an important point would be to differentiate between various levels of engagement that we will be needing. One level of engagement that is already needed now, which is regardless of the situation within Russia, is the level of crisis management. And I think that this is something that we have witnessed on a couple of occasions where we had a very heightened crisis situation with possible deployment or use of certain weapons, even nuclear weapons, and where, as far as I understand, Americans couldn't even reach anyone on the other side. This should not and cannot happen, even now. And this is something that should be restored even now and during the transformation time even more. Transformation will not be transformation towards a democratic state right away. I think this is also an option, and this is a situation that we should be also watching. And the question is, what is the second level where we can discuss with a country that is not, democratic from the very beginning? And this is, I don't think that the probability is very high that we will have a kind of Navalny type democracy Russia right away after Putin. There will be some intermediary step. And on this intermediary step, there will be questions regarding all the questions that we had also in the late 90s. You know, how can we keep Russia in a way, you know, pay respect to Russia, not humiliate Russia of a new type. These are very difficult discussions, especially in this transition period after this genocidal war. But these will be the questions where we will have to play by ear and to see how sensitive the new system will be vis-a-vis our, you know, us being outspoken regarding all the crimes that had happened before, and regarding our future understanding of what democracy should be. And that's why I think that the role of OSCE, which is a little bit it's not very much pronounced in this paper, but the role of OSCE as a platform for geostrategic discourse and discussion about the future of the region could be something where the potential is there, and where we could have an honest dialogue about that. And to be honest, I think that we should be preparing even now that OSCE should become such a place, because for now it's a hibernated in terms of its political dimensions and geopolitical dimension. It's a hibernated organizations. We have technical issues, we have ODIHR and others where this plays a role. Roland, I'll be done in a second. I see you're a little bit, but this would be a case. I don't think that certain views on international organizations are realistic. I don't think that it is realistic, for example, that we would start founding think tanks within European Parliament, merely because this is not our purpose. We are not a think tank organization. We have a research department, but having a think tank as proposed in this paper only on Russia would be difficult, because, you know, I'm doing Turkey. Wow, should we have a think tank on Turkey? Others would think we should have a think tank on China. This is a little bit unrealistic and also outside of the scope of our competence. But overall, I think that most of the ideas and proposals in this paper are very interesting, at OSCE, at different levels of engagement in times of crisis, and the lock-in dimension. And then I could subscribe to this paper myself. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sergey. Well, as an intermediate takeaway, I would formulate at this point that definitely the understanding of the European Union and the differences between the EU and other and international organizations actually has to be sharpened. We need to think in steps. This is not a one from one moment to the other thing, but a process that we're talking about. And definitely think about a prominent role for the organization, for security and cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and of course think realistically about what exactly can and cannot happen inside the European Parliament. So, having said this, I would just like to, Sergey, use the opportunity and ask you one follow-up question here. Also, based on the 1990s and the maybe not so great experience with Yeltsin Russia, which, you know, maintained imperial reflexes and activities while the West was still hoping for, and actually was certain about, a democratic future for Russia. How can we more effectively fine-tune, give and take, when it comes to Russia seriously saying farewell to the idea of empire, and the West and international organizations increasing incentives for Russia? So what kind of conditionality do you see about Russia's international behavior?
I mean, it depends on what kind of topics and what kind of people will be in power, because I truly believe that the power of leadership is always important. And Roland, you would know this is also a discussion that we're having in Germany. You know, how much should the leader lead, or should the leader follow the basic, the voters' preferences? And I think that leaders can shape those preferences and those interests very much, and do not have to follow them. So from that perspective, I think if we see a leadership that is open and does not play with imperialist kind of complexes, then we will have a much more leverage and much more room for maneuver. If we see a leadership of a kind of a post-imperial opening, and I would understand this from the kind of very pragmatic political perspective. And actually, this is, if you talk to some leaders of Russian opposition, you would hear this. They would say, we cannot preach from one to another to this electorate who has been brainwashed, who has been reshaped through propaganda. We cannot preach them liberal values of kind of an anti-imperial art. I wouldn't be able to do this because this contradicts to my moral values, but I understand kind of their constraints. From that perspective, in this case, we will have to play a different tune and to be careful not to, I don't know, talk to them about Russia as a power of regional relevance or irrelevance, like Obama said, which I think it was just not very smart at certain points. So being pragmatic and seeing how, because we will not be acting in vacuum, we will be acting vis-a-vis certain partners and certain personalities and certain trends. So the answer to your question, it will depend.
Okay, thanks a lot. Suren Avanesyan, I would like you to come in at this point. You represent the U.S. Agency for International Development. So, one of those organizations that would definitely be called upon to actually start working with civil society in Russia again, directly and openly and transparently. So what is your take on this question of complex conditionality and give and take between, in this case, the West and international organizations on the one hand, and a new Russia on the other? How do you see that moment? Over to you.
Thank you, Roland, and Free Russia Foundation for inviting me into this thinking exercise about a very complex question. For the record, I represent Suren Avanesyan. It's my personal opinion. In no shape or form, it represents the opinion of the United States government, which is very complex and nuanced. And there are many of us, and we all have different opinions. So this is mine. I think to answer this question, first and foremost, I think we need to lay an analytical framework to understand what that transition will look like. And in my mind, a post-Putin Russia means post-war Russia. And I'm just going to make this casual assumption that the two things are going to be happening simultaneously, that the war is over and Russia is transitioning into a different political regime. Just for the sake of simplicity, we'll make this assumption. So what does that mean practically? And before we get to the role of the Western organizations and how we're going to be facilitating that process, I think there are several things that we have to consider. One is what that victory in Ukraine is going to look like, right? And there will have to be some kind of victory. And that victory then we know is not going to be complete, because a complete victory means a destruction of Russia or a destruction of Ukraine. So there's going to be a partial victory that will have to be explained to the Ukrainians, to the Russians, and to the West. I think the West is going to get off easily, in my opinion, because it's a crisis that ended, and you will have political infrastructure move into the next crisis. To Ukraine, I think it's going to be incredibly complex, because you will have to rebuild the country, and you will have to hold all of the perpetrators and the criminals who committed crimes in Ukraine accountable. But in that limited victory, there will be a very difficult way to enforce that against a country that is still in place and is not going anywhere. To the Russians, however, and the regime that follows, once the war ends, the task becomes incredibly difficult because you will have to explain a partial victory to the proponents of the war and to the opponents of the war. And at some point, the regime will have to make a choice. Do you emphasize messaging to the proponents, to those who actually supported the war from day one or became supporters later on? Or do you emphasize those who were opposing the war and will be building that future democratic Russia? And that's an open question. I don't think we have an answer to that. The role of the Western organizations is going to be tricky because every organization that we listed in that report is a Western-led organization. And the West has made a choice very clear from the early 90s to, let's say, 2013, oral and verbal and political support of Ukrainian independence, and post-2013-14, financial and military support to Ukrainian independence. So the Western credibility in Russia is pretty low. And we need to now look at what that Russia will look like post-Putin, post-war. And even though this may be new players, new Russia, but that new Russia is going to be populated by the Russians who lived through the war, who lived through repression, who in some cases facilitated the war, participated, and so forth. So that's going to be very difficult to think. But what it also means that the transition, at least in my mind, the way I think about this, in that post-Putin transition, the role of transition and the people who will be actually implementing that is going to be a Russia internal process. It's going to be the Russians who will be doing that for the most part. The role of the Western organizations, I think, is going to be tenuous and limited. And I think we need to be very clear about that. In any kind of transition, the kinds of things that the Russians will probably emphasize first is going to be what we've seen many times before in other transitions, and that's going to be security. There's going to be financial security. There's going to be security, territorial security. Is going to be security of their assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there will have to be a complex mechanism by which all those things will have to be addressed by the international community. And within that international community, we'll have to decide who those players are. Now, in terms of democratic Russia, that question really depends on how that new Russia is going to address what happened in Ukraine. And that's essentially going to be a litmus test of what that new Russia is going to look like and how it's going to repay the debt it has to the country where it's committing crimes currently. And that's, again, an open question. I don't think that there's an easy answer to that. But as I said, I think the role of international organizations is going to be a limited one. Now, when I think of the people who will be reforming that Russia, we have to take into account the regime that was built collectively by Yeltsin and Putin. And in that regime, the foundation of that regime is multiple power centers that exist throughout the government, throughout Russia. And once upon a time, we talked about the conflict between Siloviki and, Civiliki, right? Those two tensions. Now that Civiliki camp is gone. We can assume that over the past 10 years. And now you have multiple centers of power within the Siloviki segments, which means the military intelligence, FSB, police, prosecutors, Rosgvardia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Within those centers, you have pyramids. And in my mind, again, as we look at competent transitions in other places, you will have to look at that pyramid, and you're going to assume that in that initial stage of post-Putin transition, people who will be doing that are going to be the ones who are at the base of a pyramid or the mid-level of that pyramid. And that's going to be, again, a tricky question for us to digest and think about, because these are the people who are now actively participating in repression, actively participating, or passively sometimes, in the war, and so forth. But these are the people, think of post-World War II Germany, when the members of the Nazi Party ended up in the government. Those were competent bureaucrats, and Russia will need competent bureaucrats post-Putin. So these people will find their way and will remain very likely in the government. So again, post-Putin transition is going to be Russia-focused and is going to be done by the Russians. The role of international community is going to be, as I said, complicated. But where I see the most important part of what we can do is that the conversation is going to be very different from what it was 30 years ago, post-Soviet transition, right? You now have a class of individuals who are our allies in that space, who think like us, who understand what democracy is and the value of democracy. You have people who are very active in civil society and civic arena. You have incredible journalism that is still taking place today in repressive Russia. There are a lot of good things. And in my mind, the future of that Russia and the transition from what it is now to what it would want to be, perhaps a democracy at one point, is going to be built on the foundation that we currently have. And we're going to build on the building blocks that we already have in place. And those building blocks are the millions of people who are not together or in sync with the regime, the people who we can describe as a very robust civil society that was able to adapt to repression and is still existing in that space. It's independent media. And of course, we will have to figure out the balance between those who are in country and those who are on the outside. And I think that's where the role of international community is going to be incredibly important. Working and supporting and focusing on those who have left, and then maintaining that connection with those who remained and who will be doing the work. And that's where I see our role. I think it's going to be an incredibly challenging enterprise, and we have to be very honest about that. In terms of the think tanks, I think there has been a lot of thinking done. The kind of transition that we're going to see is yet again going to be a repeat in some ways of the late 80s and early 90s, when you have a massive number of people transitioning in several nations, transitioning from communism to democracy and market economy, and nobody had any idea how to do that. And we live with the legacy of that. We've lived with the legacy of doing perhaps the wrong thing, doing things intuitively. Sometimes it was an educated guess, sometimes it's just pure luck. And in this case, when we're going to see the country of Russia transitioning to Europe, and I'm a firm believer that Russia is a part of Europe and it has to come back to Europe. But another part of that conversation is that there needs to be a very clear understanding in the West and in Europe that Russia is a part of it. Oh, am I out of time? And that's where the question of strategy and strategic thinking is going to be important. So yes, the work is going to be done internally in Russia by Russians, but we need to have a clear understanding that the Russia we want is going to be a democratic Russia as a part of Europe that is at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry. I mean, this was a fascinating roller coaster ride, and you opened so many cans of worms. I hardly know how to summarize this. But yeah, actually, I would start with what you said about the partial victory, and that the full victory of Ukraine would mean the destruction of Russia. I would take issue with this. I don't know about my fellow speakers here, but that might be a topic. I don't think we have the time to discuss this to the very end, but I just want to flag some, let's say, a reservation here from my side. Second, of course, the most important thing you said, and I think we have full agreement here, is Russians will have to perform this change. Nobody is going to do it for them. No citizens of other countries, no NGOs, and no governments of other countries. So it's Russians who have to change their country. You talked about another very interesting point about the post-war justice, both in its aspects relating to the war of aggression against Ukraine and crimes committed in Ukraine, but also in terms of crimes committed in Russia against Russians. That where to draw the red line and which bureaucrats will be indispensable and acceptable to a new Russia and which won't is a very, very interesting question. And of course, like for all the other questions, there are historical precedents. And then again, there are very strategic differences to these historical precedents. And of course, I'm thinking about Germany post-45. And finally, the point you brought up at the end, I think is really important and interesting. It is the role of Russia's then partners in bringing together the diaspora with the people who stayed in Russia. And we all know, everybody who was active in and observed the regime change in Central Europe after 1989 knows how tension-laden and even neurotic the relationship between diaspora and the people who stayed can be. But also where, I mean, I would say there are a couple of countries in Central Europe that manage this relationship extremely well and extremely well to the benefit of everybody and their countries. So let me leave it at this and just maybe flag my kind of reservation about what you said about the partial victory. But let's bring Sam Greene into the game here, because we're already well into our time. So Sam from CEPA, you are the think tanker here among us. Can I ask you what your take is on the points that were raised by our fellow speakers here? And just over to you, Sam.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, and also for the opportunity to go last. I won't sit here and say that I disagree with everything that was said before me. In fact, I agree with pretty much all of it. Roland, I'm going to come back in a second. I really like your heuristic of thinking about the moment, the carrot and the stick, and I'll go through that in sequence. But I do want to start with a caveat, which is that I always find it a little uncomfortable in these conversations, because these conversations are always about a future that we expect to happen of its own accord, right? And we never spend much time talking about what actually would bring that future about. Suren was brave enough to put some hypotheses on the table about the interaction between that and the war. But I think we ought to acknowledge that, right? And it has an impact on the analysis as well, because the likelihood is we will not have expected the future to be occurring the moment that it occurs. And so we will somehow be caught off guard. We will be racing to catch up. And that gets me to my first point, which is about the moment. And I think, apart from other things that have been said, the key thing about the moment is the narrative of the moment, right? And I think we need to be very careful to resist what I would call the story mongers, right? There are going to be a lot of people out there very loudly telling us exactly how we should understand what's happening as it's happening, right? We, in this conversation now, in this slow period, and in the period that really in the last 2 years and leading up to whenever this transition happens, we'll have spent a lot of time telling ourselves exactly what's already been said today, that a transition to democracy is going to be difficult, it's going to take a long time, right? The moment that there is regime change, we're going to have a lot of people telling us that it's happened, it's done, we can relax. And we'll have a lot of people telling us other things as well, right? But I think we need to be very careful about that. So we can think about who those people are. Obviously, the new regime. I agree with what Sergey said, that getting to a genuinely democratic regime is going to take time, but getting to a regime that actually talks about itself as democratic could in fact be very, very rapid. And I think we have to be cognizant of that and be careful about that. On the other side of that coin, also among Russians, we're going to have a lot of people in the diaspora community who are going to be telling us what we should think about this. They're unlikely to be telling us that things have all of a sudden become rosy and democratic. In fact, they're likely to be telling us the exact opposite, and likely to be warning Western governments off of any attempt at compromise. Unfortunately, the history of political exile communities, particularly the longer they're in exile, is that they tend to turn into sort of quasi-religious utopianist communities for whom the reality of political compromise is never quite good enough. And this is not to lay an accusation at anybody's feet, but again, something we'll want to be aware of. In the West, I think we also have to be wary, particularly, frankly, of the investment bankers. One of the biggest mistakes of the 90s and the early 2000s is that we let the conversation about Russia really be dominated by portfolio managers who were selling stories in order to sell stocks. And that's a mistake. We can, we have lots of people now telling us how irrevocably toxic the Russian market has become. I don't believe it for a second. As soon as the compliance environment shifts, money is going to flood back in. There is going to be money to be made, and we have to be very careful about that. So there is an incredibly important role, particularly for Western civil society, to play in coalition with Ukrainian civil society, Russian civil society, other post-Soviet civil society, for lack of a better term, to really help us keep focus, right, on what's actually happening and what's not happening, so that, again, we don't let the process be dominated by those people who have a stake in the decisions that we make. The carrot. I agree with what's been said that, look, we're not going to decide as Western governments or societies the outcomes in Russia. This is, at the end of the day, a process that's going to have to be driven by Russia. I'm not sure I agree, Suren, that people didn't have ideas about what to do in the 90s. I think the problem is people had way too many ideas about what to do in the 90s. We're way too confident about those ideas. And a lot of those ideas turned out to be wrong. We think we have better ideas now. They're better than they were in the 90s, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're right. And so we should be careful about, parachuting back in again. And frankly, I don't think that any post-Putin Russian government would be happy to let us parachute again, because they will also recognize the mistakes that we made. I'll come back to one of those key mistakes in a moment when I get to the sticks. But that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a lot of leverage. Almost any configuration of a post-Putin and a post-war Russian regime is going to want to open up the flow of capital from the West again. Right? Almost anything they're going to deliver, whether they're delivering that to an authoritarian elite or whether they're delivering that to the broader Russian population, right, is going to be predicated on the rediversification of Russian trade and investment flows. And that is going to create a lot of decision points for Western governments about when they begin to make that possible. That leverage, again, is quite significant. And I think we have to be very careful about the incentive structures that we create. One is to make sure that we are predicating that on not on wishful thinking, but on actions, right? So we're not making decisions because we've had a handshake with somebody or decided that somebody we can do business with, or we've looked into their eyes and seen their soul, right? But because they're doing very specific things that we know need to be done. I think we should be reticent about certain kinds of things. We do not want to be dictating to Russia what their constitution should look like, or what economic reform should look like, or what their ideology should look like necessarily, right? But changing their security relationship and their security posture, yes, right? Instituting rule of law, rolling back a lot of the legislation that we've seen, the repressive legislation that we've seen in the last 20 years, absolutely, right? That's the kind of thing that we should be very clear about, and we need to be very transparent about it, right? So at some point, we will need to map all of the levers that we have, all of the sanctions that we have, and begin to match them up against specific conditions that can be met, and then be consistent in the application of that, so that we don't inadvertently send the message to Russia that things will never get better regardless of what they do. And that then comes to the sticks. The first of which, and I promised to talk about one of the biggest mistakes of the 1990s. One of the biggest mistakes that we made conceptually was to assume that when you began to create a capital owning class, you create demand for the rule of law. That was partially correct, right? We created a capital owning class in Russia, or facilitated the creation of a capital owning class that did, in fact, have the demand for the rule of law, but they got that rule of law here in London, right? In various other Western jurisdictions, right? And they realized before we did that there is a tremendous opportunity for what I would call institutional arbitrage. In other words, you will always be able to make more money in a low rule of law environment than you can in a high rule of law environment. So if you have the opportunity to make your money in a low rule of law, corrupt, rent-seeking Russia, and to protect it in a high rule of law London or New York or wherever else. You get the best of both worlds. We can't allow that to happen again. The West can no longer be a haven for that kind of capital, and it can never allow its institutions to substitute for Russian institutions. That will be key. I think there's also, although I mentioned that the West should not dictate what the Russian constitution should look like, I think that there's going to be an important pinch point having to do with the Russian constitution. Putin has written this war into the Russian constitution, so that even when the fighting stops, unless the Russian constitution changes, Russia will be constitutionally bound to irredentist claims against Ukraine. That is going to be a very difficult thing to manage for anybody who comes next. And I don't think that we can get back to normalization with Russia until that is somehow resolved. That's going to put Western governments in particular in a very tricky situation. And I don't exactly know what the answer to that is. Very briefly, in closing then, just to sort of sum all of this up, the other big mistake that we made in the 90s and really throughout the 2000s was to allow the pace and the valence of our relationships with Russia to be shaped by our perception of Russia's interests. Europe pursued 4 common spaces and partnership for modernization. The US pursued various presidential commissions and partnerships on a take it or leave it basis. If Russia was willing to take it, we would go in that direction. If they weren't, then we were perfectly happy not to go in that direction. It was not guided by a robust Western conversation about what the West's interests vis-a-vis Russia are. Right now, we have fairly clear interests when it comes to Ukraine, but we're not yet having the conversation about what we think a fruitful relationship with Russia would look like. And we're not laying that at the feet of either Russia's current leadership or the leadership that will come next. Related to that, and my last point, is the importance of transatlantic solidarity. The current Russian government obviously tries to do what it can to create and manipulate divisions within Europe itself, but also in the transatlantic community. Any future Russian government is likely to try to do the same thing. It's incredibly important that they not be able to do that. However, Roland, I think you mentioned that Suren and USAID are likely to be at the table and part of this game. I think that would be wonderful. It's not a given, with all due respect and friendship to Suren. We don't know what the future of American politics is going to look like, but we do know that it may not look terribly productive and terribly conducive to transatlantic solidarity. And so I think that while seeking that transatlantic solidarity, it will be incumbent on European politicians and European leaders to think very seriously about what a strategically autonomous European approach to the Russian relationship would look like. And I'll leave it there.
Great. A couple of points that I would just like to highlight. Early on, Sam, you mentioned the regime that will claim to be democratic, but not necessarily be democratic. So that will be a major challenge for anybody outside of Russia. Beware of the investment bankers. And this is part actually of a larger chapter in what you said that I would call learn the lessons from the 90s. There were several really important points you made. One was about the investment bankers. The other one was definitely about this, the role of the rule of law and how the West seemingly could live with a very imperfect rule of law in Russia, which then used the rule of law in other countries. Very, very important points. Also the question of, well, what legitimate interests will a post-Putin Russia voice, and which of them will be acceptable to the rest of the world? Very important question. And then finally, you're naming transatlantic solidarity as key, but also as possibly problematic. looking at the next US election. Absolutely d'accord. So with that, I would like to actually use the remaining couple of minutes while Sergey is still here for it. I would like to give him the floor and ask him to comment a little bit on some of the points that Suren and Sam brought up here. Such as, for example, what is your view of the mistakes of the 90s and the lessons we have to draw from this? I mean, which is the maybe 2 or 3 most important points, Sergey, in your mind that we have to do differently from the 90s? I would also like to ask you more specifically about this general question that Suren brought up. I mean, what can be the role of people and organizations and governments outside of Russia? How much can they actually move in a Russian transition? So over to you, Sergey, before you have to leave us.
Thank you, and thanks. A couple of general points and answers to your question. Maybe to start with the last one, I do feel a bit irritated and provoked by the general perception that I also see within the realm of the realm of Russian opposition, that it is the West or it is the outside actors who bear responsibility on what is happening inside of Russia. This is a general trend. I do not want to say that nobody is responsible outside of Russia, but these are not the key actors. I don't think that what we are seeing and witnessing now is the responsibility solely or mostly of those outside, and this is not for them to solve this problem. To put it bluntly on the other side, because I'm always confronted with this, and I'm a little bit increasingly irritated because of this, is of course in giving up the agency of your own fate. And of course, everyone is human. We would do the same probably in a situation like this, but we have to make it very clear. And this will not change in the future during the transformation. The main role and the main agency will be within the Russian people, regardless of their political orientation, and this is their responsibility. Mistakes of the 90s, I mean, we have a parallel debate, of course, about the role of the 90s and mistakes within Russia. We could start producing documentaries on how it is the West who is in fault. I mean, basically what the report said, what Sam said, the role of kind of this belief of unleashing cold market forces and understanding that the end of history means that these market forces will per se bring democracy and solidify democracy. This is one of the general legends and myths that we have to say goodbye to, and it's not limited to Russia only. I mean, we all have a similar situation where the freedom of markets is no more a security for freedom of society. Those myths are over, but we projected those myths, and of course, coupled with very specific financial interests that Sam mentioned, this was one of the problems that maybe this is one of the responsibilities where we don't have responsibility, and we should not get into this trap, is that by not engaging with Russia, this is of course the narrative from the other side, and from those Putin versteher that we have, that this is our fault because we didn't engage with Russia, we didn't include Russia. Well, this is not true. Russia was included. Russia, we have a NATO council with Russia. This is a false narrative that we shouldn't, and we should really be very careful about countering. I think the general point on this debate is, and Sam mentioned it, and I think that Suren mentioned it as well. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the parameters are going to be in the future, and depending on those parameters, we will have to tune and tune our policies. But we have to prepare the ground. This is what it is about, and we have to make certain assumptions also for us. So, for example, what is going to be the role of post-conflict justice? How flexible are we about that? This is a question which we already can start talking about now. Maybe not publicly, because for obvious reasons. We don't want to signal to anyone that we are proponents of any type of impunity. But within the responsibility issues, there is a room for maneuver. What is the role for us accepting certain, I would say, post-imperial claims? And how do we deal with that? Because I do think that those claims will not disappear, even if it is a democratic and really democratic system, not even a fake democratic system. I think that this tune will continue purely for cultural reasons. Or how do we want, or do we want a kind of a re-education, and do we have capabilities, and do we have at all possibility for re-education programs? How much of amount of trust do we have into Russian society per se? This is something that we already can discuss now, and general readiness or not readiness to integrate Russia at some point into some sort of European family. These are questions that we already can start discussing. And these are very difficult questions per se. And one question that I think that is mentioned in the report, that I mentioned again and again, and I think Suren and Sam always mention, is the recognition, building trust and belief and confidence in Russian, in democratic part of Russian society. This is something, if we don't manage this, then we can forget about any kind of optimistic scenarios in the future. I always said, and translating into an interest paradigm, and not just a humanitarian paradigm, understanding that our interests, I usually said, we have three strategic interests as European Union. Number one, that Ukraine prevails. Number two, that we integrate Ukraine into European structures. And number three, that Alexei Navalny survives. Well, but Alexei Navalny for me was not only a person, it's also an embodiment of the remaining Russian forces, democratic forces. So now we have to understand this is in our interest, that these people survive, that we do everything possible, that they are free, that they will not die in prisons, and that they can survive in the European Union. This is the only chance, the slim but only chance for a democratic future of Russia. We have to understand that this is our strategic interest. Number three, not number one and two, but number three. And built on that, we will also build a foundation for any scenarios that will be upcoming in the future. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. I have to leave. I have to speak with the foreign minister on the same stage. So we have election campaign. Thank you, and looking forward to continuing in other frameworks.
Thanks so much, Sergey. Give our best to Annalena Baerbock. And folks, we will continue with a question asked by Natasha Lunde about the political prisoners. So actually in the chapter that we're discussing of the publication, this is a prominent point. And it's not only the immediate release of political prisoners and rehabilitation, but also basically withdrawing the whole foreign agents law. So, immediately legalizing political participation and political participation supported by governments, by agencies, by NGOs outside of Russia. So who is volunteering to respond to this question? Let me know. Suren, would you like to comment on this?
Sure, it's a good question. I think it's a given that in the new Russia, you'll have to release political prisoners the same way they did 30 years ago. It's a given that you will have to change legislation that is repressive. Going back to the point that Sam made, the Constitution will have to be rewritten. It was written for one individual several years ago, rewritten. That has to change. So yeah, there are some very basic things that will need to take place. However, remembering what happened in the late 80s and early 90s when you did have political prisoners released, when you did have this opening, it didn't necessarily lead to the democracy. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, that yes, there are all the steps that can be taken easily can be taken, and that new quasi-democratic regime probably will take, and we will like that, and we'll talk about this a lot. But ultimately, there will need to be a deeper structural change. And here, I think what we really need to keep in mind is going to be the question of the timing and the scope. And the timing is that we have to be exceptionally in tune with the changes that are taking place and be there when is needed with the right type of support. And that means paying such a close attention, and that's where I think our Russian colleagues come into place, is decoding the language in a way that only they can understand, and knowing our Western institution and the way the West operates, mobilizing the support that they will need at that time to push things forward. One thing is that we've seen in so many places that if you look at post-communist transitions in Eastern Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, they were all done in the context of Euro-Atlantic integration. There's no other democratic transition outside of that context. And even with that context, you have a lot of backsliding over the past 10, 12, 14 years. Okay, so that's where it becomes very important that, and I've been talking about this for so many years, is that democratic reform in the abstract does not happen. It has to be connected to something tangible. And something tangible that we offered to the Europeans after the fall of communism was Euro-Atlantic integration. So at some point, somebody will have to answer that question. And in my mind, I think it was Sam mentioned it, it will have to be Ukrainian civil society and Russian civil society and Moldovan civil society and Belarusian and Armenian and Georgian working together, because they will need to move that old empire into the framework that is post-imperial, but also a part of that larger Europe where countries and nations share the same values. And there's going to be a collective progression. I do not believe that Russia that stays on the outside of Euro-Atlantic institutions is going to be a peaceful Russia. That's just not going to be the case. It is going to look after its own interests and is going to enforce its interests any way it pleases, unless we force it into something else. So that's just something that we need to keep in mind. But again, I think there will be some simple fixes in the first days or first months of the political transition, and political prisons obviously would be one of them. But those simple fixes are not going to be solving some really deep structural issues that still remain in that place and will remain for decades to come.
Yeah, thanks, Suren. Sam, I would like to give you the opportunity to come in at this point. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that Suren said. We at CEPA published a report not too long ago on containment as an approach to Russia, and one of the points that we made there was that any future détente, right, with Russia will need to be predicated on a series of very real steps, one of which will need to be the release of political prisoners, the repeal of repressive legislation, and the restoration of the rule of law, the democratic franchise, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of conscience. Exactly how and when that happens, right, is something obviously that Russia's going to have to figure out on its own. But I would also really underscore something that Suren said, which is that in and of itself is a necessary but insufficient condition for democratization. And I think one of the challenges that we're going to face is that depending on how this transition happens, the sorts of governments that are going to be able to do rather quickly the things that we want them to do may not be the sorts of governments that we want them to, that we will want to be facing in Russia down the road, right? And clarify what I mean by that. Again, coming back to the CEPA report that we published, we do believe that, I believe, and my co-authors on that report believe, that Russia's aggressive approach, right, right now, Russia's aggression is not an issue of the moment. It is the result of a lengthy learning process among Russia's post-Soviet leadership that has led them to conclude that this is the way that they need to pursue their interests, and that itself is predicated in the structure of governance within Russia. So I absolutely agree with Suren that we will not get to a peaceable relationship with Russia unless Russia comes to be governed in a way that is at least compatible with the way that Europe is governed. It's the only way that it comes to see its interests differently, durably in the long run. However, in the short term, again, for reasons I started with, it will be, I think, perfectly plausible to see a Russian government come to power that decides that it wants to come out from under sanctions, normalize relations with the West, maybe even normalize relations with Ukraine, maybe hand back bits and pieces of territory, if not all of the territory. Doing that is going to require explaining to the Russian people that this was all a big mistake. Explaining that to the Russian people is going to be much easier to do in a non-competitive political environment, when you control the electoral process, when you control the television, when you control the repressive apparatus. And so we may likely face a Russian government that does some things that we like and some things that we don't, but that because it remains fundamentally an authoritarian government, is likely to find its way back to conflict with the West. That's something we need to be careful about. And we need to be very careful about keeping our eye on the ball, not allowing ourselves to give away the game too early, right? In return for certain kinds of liberalization and certain kinds of normalization, without moves that really get to the fundamental nature of how power operates in Russia.
Yes, some very important points you raised at the very end here. I would like to conclude in about 10 minutes. So let's have a last round of statements, and just to throw a little pebble into this debate, let me quote Zbigniew Brzezinski, who actually claimed Russia is either an empire or a democracy. So several of you have hinted at that even a democratic Russia might voice imperial interests, or talk about a near abroad, or talk about a special relationship with neighboring countries. Frankly speaking, I doubt that. That will not be a democratic Russia. That will not even be a Russia on the way to democracy. So I would very, very black and white, in a black and white way, claim, look, it's either empire or democracy. And in fact, there's a third element, which is a true federation, which has never been seriously tried in Russia, not even in the 90s. But what do you think about this? Drawing a clear line between these concepts, that it's either a democracy or an empire. Over to you, Sam.
Well, far be it from me to disagree with Big. First of all, I'm glad you raised federalization, partly because it gives me a way out of a difficult question. But it's incredibly important, and it's something that. So you mentioned, or we've alluded to Navalny's sort of manifesto for the sorts of reforms he would like to see, the creation of a parliamentary republic, first and foremost among them. One of the things that's missing from that manifesto is federalism, and the revisiting, particularly of interethnic relations and center-peripheral relations within Russia. That's something that even the best of the Russian democratic opposition has not really got to grips with yet, and something for which doesn't really have the language to have that conversation yet. But I cannot see Russia making genuine progress towards democratization without federalism. I think it will simply fail to hold together. However, on your point about empire, I think it comes down to what constitutes an empire. Will there be imperialist constituencies, chauvinist constituencies, racist constituencies in Russia that will compete amongst others within a democratic political system at some point? Absolutely. Do I ever think that any of that all of that's going to disappear? I mean, I wish there's a lot of things that I wish would disappear in American politics or British politics or German politics for that matter, and that don't, right? Unfortunately, some cultural elements, right, culture is durable, right? On the other hand, culture changes, right? And history is not fate, culture is not destiny, whatever the euphemism is and the meme is, right? But the reality is that every country that did not have a democratic political culture, every country that currently has a democratic political culture at some point in time did not have one, right, and had to develop one. And I see no reason to believe that Russia at some point cannot develop one. There is something very important happening in the Russian diaspora now, which is the development of a language for talking about Russian imperialism in a way that it has never had to talk about before. Right? But that is going to be absolutely vital if Russia is ever going to reconcile with Ukraine, but also if it's ever going to reconcile with itself. That's the kind of thing I think right now that can only happen in exile. It's impossible to have that conversation fruitfully in Russia and safely in Russia. But one of the things that people in this conversation and others will be able to do over time is to support the development carefully, but to support and nurture the development of that language and then support people in reintroducing that language into Russia itself when the time is right. I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much. Suren, I would like to stick to this cultural point here. So yes, there is no such thing as a predetermined cultural predisposition of nations. Nations can change and reinvent themselves. So question to you, does Russia need a new Solzhenitsyn, someone a poet, a bard that sings the new free Russia? Maybe it's going to be an anti-Solzhenitsyn, actually, to be more precise in many ways. So what about this cultural question? How do you see that, Suren?
Thank you, Roland. This is a great conversation. I'm enjoying it very much. And I see an incredible value in conversation about Russia, and a public-private conversation, but as many as possible, because these are not easy topics to digest and process and figure out the way forward. On the topic of Solzhenitsyn, I believe one is enough. I don't think they need another one. When I think about this, on the topic of Russia and its ability to do this and that, etc., what I personally struggled with and pushed against very forcefully over many years is any attempt of cultural or historic determinism. I don't believe in that stuff. I believe it's all environmental. I know there are millions of Russians of different brands and kinds, etc., who ended up in the West and have done quite well. We all vote, we pay our taxes, we work in the government, we have some very high positions in the national security apparatus, etc., 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 and we're leaders of business and literature and science in Western societies. So we know that the Russians can be a part of the West because they are part of the West. Now, what we're confronting here is that the cynicism that we developed, perhaps the Russians have developed, over Western values and democracy, and we have to overcome that cynicism. But let's be frank, we're confronting this cynicism in our societies in the West as well. So this is a crisis that we're experiencing across the board. And we can talk about this for hours and the reasons and so forth, but that's the reality. It does not mean that the democracy in Russia is not possible. It's going to be a Russian democracy. It's going to be democracy by the Russians and for the Russians. But what we have here, and I think it's important to kind of think back what happened in the 90s. You did have a society that was moving towards democracy. You had a society that for 3 decades accepted Ukrainian independence. You have a lot of things that were positive and moving in the right direction. And you had, between roughly 2012 and 2022, a renaissance of the Russian civil society, something that we missed in the West, but it did take place. Very robust, active volunteerism, contributions, and this and that and the other, etc. So there are a lot of positive things that have been taking place. It's been overshadowed by one person and our obsessive focus on one individual. And we need to understand how this one individual subverted using the apparatus that really was unchanged, and that's the security apparatus. One of the biggest tragedies, I believe, still, of the early 90s is that the security apparatus was not dismantled, but the KGB endured, and it quietly subverted democracy in Russia. The process that started in the 80s and continued throughout the 90s and completed in the 2000s. And what you have here, we need to understand how that person with the apparatus that surrounds him diverted the reforms and subverted the reforms in the ways that resulted in Russia today. Now, I think it's important to understand that the foundations for democracy, I strongly believe they're present in Russia. And I think it's going to be in the form of those tens of millions. We can debate, is it 10 million, is it 20 million, is it 30 million, is it 40 million? It's irrelevant in my mind. The bottom line is, and that's a fundamental difference between mid-80s, late 80s, and early 90s, that there are quite a few Russians today who actually know what democracy looks like, what it delivers, and so forth. Going back to the question of federalism, I think that's an exceptionally important question because some people are threatened by that. But we saw the results of federalism in the 90s, and it worked. It worked. I would argue it worked in some ways. But you also had a country that was transitioning towards market economy. And that's where, Roland and others, I think that's where it's going to be extremely important. It's going to be extremely important from the point of view of US government and the West to be incredibly consistent when it comes to us talking about that future of Russia. And what we need to be emphasizing every day, honestly, is the values, is democracy, is the fact that the space needs to stay open. Okay, and that's going to be incredibly important. We get distracted by things. In the 90s, I think we were distracted, absolutely right, Sam, we were distracted by the privatization and the money that could easily be made in that space. It was an easy distraction. And time and again, look at what's happening in Georgia today, the Republic of Georgia. It's amazing how quickly things can fall apart. And what it means is that there needs to be the degree and extent of political attention that is very difficult for us in the West to consistently generate. I mean, that's going to be a challenge here, how to remain focused on democracy and democracy in Russia and the countries around Russia. That's going to be a challenge, and let's be frank about this. But in terms of the positive things, the positive thing is, just think about this. It's 2024, May 29th. We're 2.5 years into the war. We're, 12 years into the war in Ukraine in general? We have 20+ years of repressive regime in Russia that suppressed any type of freedom of speech, freedom of broadcast, etc., cracking down on civil society for the past 12 years. And even in today's Russia, we still have free civil society that is still doing important things. And we still have press, free press. I was at the conference not long ago where we had almost 20 journalists who came from that place, who is still publishing stories about the war, who is still publishing stories about the abuses by the government, etc. That journalism still exists there. And this is the kind of thing that we need to kind of think about, that there are a lot of logical disconnects in that space. And we can choose to focus on the negative, we can choose to focus on the positive, but it's a mix. It's always shades of gray. And the Russia that is going to emerge is going to be a hybrid Russia. Whether it's an empire or whatever, I don't think those are mutually exclusive things. Russia, if it stays in its current borders, it is an empire. okay? And if it's going to be the Kingdom of Moscovia, perhaps it would not be. But that's not the Russia that we're going to be dealing with. It's going to be probably Russia within its current borders. And then we just need to think about this in the framework. Is this the country that shares our values? And our values are human rights, democracy, free and fair elections, freedom of speech, and freedom of association, and so forth. I mean, that's where I would end. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this realistically optimistic picture that you drew at the end, I think, is a great way to already lead over to my takeaways, which are admittedly arbitrary. But I would see three things. I mean, the most important statement that has been made by all participants here is that Russian transformation is for Russians. And of course, the West and international organizations have a role to play, but ultimately, Russia can only become a better place by the actions of Russians themselves. So the second thing that transpired in all these statements is this process of transition will be an extremely challenging point in time when everything depends, like the lifting of sanctions and the reestablishment of positive relations with the rest of the world will depend on what exactly happens in Russia itself and what the steps taken exactly are in this transition. But I think Sergey gave us a pretty good list of things that we can already think about and already discuss right now. And that is, of course, never mind when the moment comes that we need to recalibrate the whole relationship with Russia because something is moving in Moscow. We can already discuss the whole post-war justice question, and that post-war, I mean, post-Ukraine war, but also post-dictatorship in Russia itself. It always has this external and internal component. The question of well, post-imperial claims, even by a Russian democracy, I have my personal doubts that this will then it's not a full democracy. But okay, let it be. Sam, Suren, you said at the very end that even a Russia in its current borders would be an empire. I say not if it's a federation. But that's for another debate. I think we should have a separate debate about this internal configuration of a future Russia. But the third point that Sergey made, I think, is extremely important: the readiness of Russia's partners in the future to step by step integrate Russia into Europe in whatever shape or form. You know, I mean, that certainly doesn't mean immediate EU membership or NATO for that matter, but some kind of formalized integration into Europe. And let me conclude with this idea. By the time Putin leaves the Kremlin, it will probably be against his will, and maybe he won't even be in one piece anymore. But by the time he leaves the Kremlin, Russia is going to be in a pretty terrible shape on several levels. In several areas. It's going to be militarily, economically, in terms of its cohesion, in terms of maintaining public order and so on and so on. Russia is going to face challenges that any successor will have a hard time to answer by continuing Putinism. So I say the incentives to condemn Putinism and blame it for Russia's predicament will be very high. I'm not saying it's going to automatically happen. I'm not saying that what comes after Putin will necessarily have to be better than Putin. But I'm just saying that there is a probability, there is a number of incentives for Putin's successor or successors to do things fundamentally differently. And that will entail a degree of Russians claiming, but we had no idea. We didn't know. We were lied to, right? I mean, again, I'm reliving the post-45 moments of Germany. But guys, this is going to be a challenging time. And there's a few things we do not know. There's a whole bunch of things we do not know at this point in time. But there's a few things we can already do. And that is addressing these points that I just listed up and that you already talked about with so much eloquence and so much involvement. So thank you, Suren. Thank you, Sam. Thanks, Natasha, for putting this together. I have a certain inkling that this will not be the last time we discuss a future Russia and its relation with the rest of the world. But for today, I want to wrap it up and hope to see you soon. And we're certainly going to continue the conversation. Thank you.